Welcome to Studies with Stearman. Join us as we look deeper into the Bible. Strengthen your faith with us, even as we see the day approaching. And now, here's Gary.
We're going to be in John chapter 18 this morning. Usually, when we talk about the period surrounding Christ's resurrection, traditionally, we've talked about Christ as typified in the elements of the Passover, how the Passover Seder speaks of Christ's complete finished work. And we do Christ in the Passover year after year. This year, we're going to do something completely different. And I think that you'll find it, as I did, rather an amazing truth that we have not studied before. John 14, 15, 16, 17, Christ's words to his disciples, a continuing discourse when he answered the disciples' tough questions, when he described the relationship that his people would have to him, when he described what was about to happen to him and to them. And he said, the world hated me, it's going to hate you. His prediction of his own death and resurrection in the 16th chapter. And then in the 17th chapter, which we studied last week, Christ prayed for himself, he prayed for his disciples, he prayed for all who would ever come to believe. His prayer was crowned in John 17:23, where he said, I in them and thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one. Speaking of that metaphoric, metaphysical relationship that we have with the Father through Christ that is completely beyond our understanding. And what's amazing is that when John writes, he writes 4 chapters of Jesus' continuing monologue. Jesus talks without ceasing, and then they're in the garden. Jesus is arrested. And from that point on, he says practically nothing. He answers a few direct questions, but he has said, essentially, all he's going to say. Verse 26 of chapter 17 says, And I have declared unto them thy name, and will declare it, that the love wherewith thou hast loved me may be in them, and I in them. Now, we have here an event that took place at night, on the eve of Passover, on the 14th, going into the 15th of Nisan. And something happens at this time of the year in the Jewish calendar that we're going to be talking about. Because the 14th of Nisan, that is Passover, which has come to be called Easter in our era, but which I'd rather call Resurrection Day, because Passover has to do with the finished work of Christ. And Easter is a word that comes out of the Middle Ages, and it's the name of basically a Northern European fertility goddess, Eostre, so I'd prefer not to use that. The word Easter only appears once in the New Testament as a translation of Pesach, which is Passover. So we're going to be talking about Passover. And what we find is that Jesus is arrested. He has 2 Jewish trials and 2 Roman trials, as given in John chapter 18. First, he is tried before Annas, and then he's tried before Caiaphas. Then he's taken to Pilate, not once, but twice. And so it's kind of fascinating that the Bible records 4 specific trials and 4 specific events. The final event, the most important event, is his coronation. Nisan, the first month in the Jewish calendar, is called in the Jewish histories the New Year for Kings. Basically, there are 4 Jewish New Years. Everybody knows about the New Year in the fall, Rosh Hashanah. Everybody's heard about the New Year for trees. Everybody's heard about the New Year for cattle. But have you heard about the New Year for Kings? The first of Nisan in the Jewish calendar is called the New Year for Kings. Passover comes 2 weeks after that Jewish New Year. Nisan 1, you count 14 days, and it's the eve of Passover, which is what we have in John chapter 18. Now, Jesus is our King. And what you discover in the book of John is that he was officially crowned as king, although that's not usually recognized. David was crowned king on Passover. When on Passover? Well, Jewish history says that King David was crowned after the taking of the Seder, or the cups, the lamb and the cups of Passover. Then David was crowned king, and the counting of years of his reign was backdated to the first of Nisan, to the new year for kings. And after David came Solomon, and then the kings of the north and the south, and they were all crowned on Passover up until 722 BC and the Assyrian captivity, and then later in Judea and Samaria in 606 BC, Babylonian captivity came, and all the events that led up to their captivity. At that point, the reigns of kings stopped being accounted from Nisan 1 until, guess what? Until Jesus came. And he was crowned exactly the way King David was on Passover, on Nisan 14, and his reign was backdated to Nisan 1, which is the new year for kings. So let's read some scripture. This all started in the garden. John 18, verses 1 through 11 talk about the events of his arrest, in which Peter grabbed his sword and tried to defend his Lord, and guess what? He was very ineffective because that was not his trade. He was not a soldier, and Jesus told him to put up his sword. He says, "The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it?" And now that cup is his cup of destiny. He has already consumed the cup of redemption with them at their Passover supper, just a few hours before this. The cup spoken of here is the cup of his destiny, the cup of his suffering that he must partake of. And so in that Passover, you have two cups. You have the traditional 4 cups of Passover, and specifically the cup of redemption, which he took with the disciples. But you have another cup here, which is the cup of his suffering. He is taken away. Verse 12, "Then the band and the captain, the officers of the Jews, took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people." Caiaphas, being high priest, no matter how sinful, no matter how misguided, which the priesthood certainly was by the time of Jesus, nevertheless he spoke for the Lord by divine decree. And he had predicted that it was expedient for one man to die for the people. Back in John chapter 11, verse 50, we read in verses 49 and 50 of John 11, "And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, You know nothing at all." They were planning some way to get rid of Jesus, even to the point of killing him. And he says, "You know nothing at all, nor consider it that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and the whole nation perish not." And so, essentially, he was speaking divine prophecy without realizing it. He was saying that one man was going to die for the people, which is exactly what happened. Then, and we're not going to follow it in detail, Simon Peter, the story of Peter warming his hands over the enemy fires takes place, in which Peter denied Christ 3 times. Then in the 24th verse, "Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself," and we have the story of Peter who denies Christ 3 different times. He says, "I'm not one of his disciples." Second time, he says, "I am not one of his disciples." Third time, he was asked, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" And he said, "No, you didn't." And that's when the cock crowed. Verse 28, "Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early." This would be the hall of judgment at the north end of the Temple Mount. In those days, it was the fortress of Antonia, where the Roman garrisons were stationed and where the offices of Pontius Pilate were located, just adjacent to the Temple Mount. Verse 28 says, "They led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover." And so they were concerned about eating the Passover on the 15th of Nisan, the next day, And they knew that if they went into the Roman territory, they would be defiled. They'd have to go through ritual cleansing, and therefore they wouldn't be able to eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them and said, "What accusation bring you against this man?" Pilate was a bureaucrat, a Roman bureaucrat, and he was preoccupied with law, with the law of the territories, making sure that Roman rule prevailed in this outpost called Judea. He had been sent to Jerusalem in AD 26 by the Emperor Tiberius, and Rome was at that point in its glory. Very powerful, very wealthy, very corrupt. You didn't get a job like Pontius Pilate got unless you were corrupt, I guarantee you, unless you had greased the right palms, unless you had spoken to the right people. Tiberius and Pilate knew each other on a first-name basis. They corresponded. Tacitus, in his histories, and others record some of the transactions that took place back in those days. But let's put it this way. Pilate was a cynical Roman bureaucrat. He came in AD 26. He did not really want to come to Judea. Nobody wanted to come to Judea. That was kind of considered a rough territory. It was a place where you had to prove yourself if you were a Roman. Pilate was called the fifth procurator of Judea. There had been 4 before him, and they had met with varying degrees of difficulty. Pilate himself had nothing but trouble after he came, and then after the crucifixion of Christ, his life was a horror story, ending in his own suicide a few years later. But he was the 5th procurator. He was a legalist. And by the way, Roman law was extremely formal. And when he comes out and he says, "What accusation bring ye against this man?" In essence, it's a challenge. He's saying, "You'd better have a good charge." They answered and said unto him, "If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee." What's their answer? Do they answer with a specific charge? Absolutely not. They have no charge. What they say to him is, "Hey, don't question us. If he were not a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. He's a criminal." Then Pilate said unto them, "Take him, judge him according to your law." The Jews therefore said unto him, "It's not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die." So they're getting into a little legalistic battle here. Whose jurisdiction? What charges? Well, there are no charges. And neither jurisdiction wants to be responsible for executing this man or for executing judgment upon him because he's very popular with the people. We got a political battle going on here. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, "Art thou King of the Jews?" Now get this picture. Pilate, no doubt a man in a Roman toga, beautiful setting, sitting on the Roman judgment seat called the Bema in the fortress of Antonia, a place that was no doubt decorated with Roman art, very formal. It was called the Judgment Hall, but essentially it was Rome itself. It was an extension of the throne of Caesar. When you were called into the Judgment Hall, you were essentially being called before Caesar. The Roman procurator is a proxy for Caesar. He calls him in, and he asks him a very odd question. And this question is absolutely key to what we're going to be studying. Pilate, this cynical bureaucrat who didn't know anything, very ignorant, no doubt, of the finer points of Judaism, says, "Are you King of the Jews?" What a question. Well, no doubt Pilate had been briefed. No doubt he had been watching what was going on. And no doubt he knew that that was the center of the controversy. A lot of people were saying Jesus should be declared Messiah. In fact, there was a whole faction who wanted to declare Jesus to be Messiah the King. So what did Jesus do? Well, in perfect Pilpul Jewish manner, he answered a question with a question. This is perfect Judaism. "Are you King of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Do you say this thing of yourself, or did others tell it thee of me?" In other words, did you come up with this all by yourself, or did you have others brief you about which questions to ask me? And Pilate answers, obviously disgusted, "Am I a Jew? In other words, I couldn't have come up with this question by myself, nor do I ask it with any objectivity. He says, am I a Jew? Thine own nation, the chief priests, have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? And then Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. And he's beginning to speak in very abstruse terms about the nature of his kingdom. Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou a king then? And by the way, notice the way this thing is proceeding. What's the question? Are you king of the Jews? That's the question. That's still the question today. It is the question that has to be answered even right now. It has to be answered not only immediately, but it has to be answered correctly. Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou a king then? So we got a little battle of the wits going here, a battle of innuendo and shading of terms. Jesus answered, thou sayest that I'm a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Then Pilate said to him those immortal words, what is truth? Beautiful philosophical question. If you're a Roman, if you're a Greek, you're preoccupied with that philosophical question. What is truth? Nobody knows what the truth is, right? I mean, you can't really define truth unless you define it through Jesus, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. But Pilate is philosophically oriented. He says, what's truth? Nobody knows what the truth is, in effect. When he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. Not guilty. But ye have a custom, that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will you therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? Notice this. Pilate has no qualms at all, no difficulty in referring to Jesus as King of the Jews. I think he did it to push the question. He's transferred the question back to the house of David and to the temple priesthood. Then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. And we all know the story about how Barabbas was released because the crowd wanted him to be released. Barabbas was a well-known member of a group called the Sicarii. And the Sicarii were named after a little dagger, a little curved dagger about 10 inches long called a Sicari, which was concealed inside of one's clothing. And the Sicarii were assassins who would sneak up behind a Roman soldier and slip that blade between his ribs and then disappear into the crowd before anybody knew that they had even been there. And the saying is that Barabbas was not just a robber, but he was a member of Sicarii. He was a mean, nasty, and ugly character, and he was essentially a rabble-rouser. The crowd said, give us Barabbas. Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Now, the scourging of Jesus, which is a horrendously cruel act in which a scourge breaks the skin open. We've all heard and read and probably seen the movie where the scourging of Christ is enacted with incredible detail. A horrific look at the inside of the events that lead up to crucifixion. This scourging was done on what basis? No legal basis whatsoever. We've just seen how Jesus was bounced back and forth between the temple priests, the lawyers, the scribes on the one hand, and the Roman procurator on the other. And so they then simply take Jesus and treat him as a common criminal on the basis of no particular law being broken. It was simply an act of hatred based upon the fact that Jesus was a very popular figure. This was a political trial. Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. We're going to come back to that crown of thorns in just a little bit. What do they say? What do the Romans say? Hail, King of the Jews. And by the way, you can tell that it's the Romans talking because they use the term hail. Hail, King of the Jews. The common salutation for addressing a king, for example, if Caesar shows up, you say, Hail Caesar. This was the Roman method of address. And so, essentially, you had the soldiers, the authorities of the Antonia fortress addressing Christ as a king. Now, I think they were mocking Judaism, period. The Romans hated the Jews. And they used this opportunity to say, oh, you got a king? Okay, let's show you how we treat your king. And they dressed him up, put a crown on him, and said, oh, hail, King of the Jews. This was just grinding it into the authorities of the temple. It was just grinding salt into their wounds. Pilate therefore went forth again, and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. In other words, he's not guilty. In fact, we're even going to crown him king. Here he is. He's got his robes on. He's got his crown on. He's king. This is nasty stuff. What Pilate is doing here is just rubbing it in the faces of the temple authorities, making fun of them. Then came Jesus forth wearing the crown of thorns, the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. What's he saying? What's he saying? He's saying, and if you look at the Greek language in the New Testament, you discover that what Pilate is really saying is, look, here's the one. That's what he's really saying. In King James English, it says, Behold the man. But if you check out the Greek, what he's really saying is, look, here's the one. And you have to ask the question, what one is he referring to? He no doubt has heard that the Jews are expecting the Messiah to come. The Messiah will be a great political leader who will lead them to victory over the Romans. And he's saying, again, rubbing it in the faces of the Jews, he's saying, look, here's the one you've been waiting for. So you got this bloody guy in a robe and a crown of thorns, and he's mocking him. He's making fun of them. Here's the one. Here's your Messiah. This is the first of two pronouncements that Pilate makes. And this is very important to note. Very important indeed. When the chief priests, therefore, and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. So what do they respond? When he says, here's your man, here's the one you've been waiting for, they say, oh, no, he's in your jurisdiction, crucify him. And, of course, Jews couldn't crucify anyone. Only the Romans could, and they only crucified especially bad people who were considered to be enemies of the state and who were not holders of Roman citizenship. It would be against Roman law to crucify a Roman citizen. So, what you have here is these two authorities bouncing Jesus back and forth between them. You have the priestly authority on the one hand, you have the Roman procurate on the other hand, and they're bouncing Jesus back and forth like a ball, saying, he's your responsibility, no, he's your responsibility, no, he's your responsibility. They are playing a game of legal football here. Verse 7 says, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. What did Pilate do? This is fascinating to me. It says, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more what? Afraid. He was afraid. Wow. Now he's starting to see these guys really believe he's the Son of God, and they want him killed, because he would totally destroy their corruption. He would totally destroy their patrimony, their little racket. And they think he's the Son of God, which struck fear into Pilate's heart. He was afraid, and he went again into the judgment hall, and saith unto Jesus, Where do you come from? Interesting question. He didn't say, Who are you? What are you doing here? When did you arrive? Why are you here? How'd you get here? He said, Where did you come from? What an interesting question to ask Jesus. Meaning, did you come from earth or did you come from someplace else? Jesus gave no answer. Pilate says to him, You're not speaking to me? Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you? I have the power to release you. Then Jesus, in a masterful stroke, this is God talking. Jesus looks him in the eye and says, You could have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Wow, you could discuss that all day long. There's a month's discussion. in that statement by Jesus. Jesus puts it exactly where it lies. Sin. And from thenceforth, Pilate sought to release him. Pilate saw something that the Jewish priests saw. They both saw this man must be from God. We've got to destroy him. He's dangerous. I think they all knew who he was, and they weren't about to worship him. They wanted him dead. That's what I think. Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend." Or it's going to get back to Caesar, and we'll make sure that it does, and then you're going to be in deep trouble. If you're a Roman bureaucrat in trouble with Caesar, you get called back to Rome and chastised, and you may lose all of the perks of the empire. And that may be the best thing that happens to you. So they're threatening him with Caesar now. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth, sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour, about 6 a.m. Roman time, early in the morning. He goes back out to the Jews, and he says, "Behold your king." Now, back up in verse 5, remember what he had said? He went out and spoke to the Jews and said, "Behold the man. Here's the one you've been waiting for. This is the man." But now he goes out and he says, "Look, here's your king." So he's elevated it just a little bit. He's not saying, "This is the one you've been waiting for." Now he says, "This is the king." But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate says to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" Chief priests answered and said, "We have no king but Caesar." Self-condemnation. Wow. For a priest to say that? I would hate to be that priest on Judgment Day. Wow. Really? That's horrible. We have no king but Caesar. You notice this whole thing is a legal confab between two opposing parties. And you have Roman law on the one side, temple law on the other, and neither sets of law is capable of dealing with the question of the kingship of Jesus. They delivered him, therefore, unto them to be crucified. They took Jesus, led him away. Back in the days of Moses, Moses received the law, and he received the festival calendar, and it was in the days of Moses that the Jewish calendar became formalized under law. Flavius Josephus writes concerning this, Moses appointed that Nisan should be the first month for their festivals. So Moses said, your first month, the beginning of your festival calendar is going to be Nisan, because he brought them out of Egypt in that month. The Passover is the 14th of Nisan. And so Moses said, we have come out, we're going to commemorate our release from bondage in the Egyptians by keeping this calendar, which is going to begin in the month of Passover, starting at Nisan 1. And Josephus writes, so that this month began the year as to all the solemnities that they observed to the honor of God, although he preserved the original order of the months as to selling and buying and other ordinary affairs. When they had been in Egypt, the new year in Egypt, in the Egyptian calendar, comes in the fall. The new year in the Jewish calendar comes in the spring. While they were in Egypt, they kept the Egyptian calendar. When they came out, they started keeping the Jewish calendar, and they kept that calendar until the Babylonian captivity, and then it was kept again during the days of the temple of Herod. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what happens is this. Passover came to be known as the Rosh Hashanah for kings, the head of the year or the new year for kings. In the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the kings of Israel are said to have been crowned at Passover. In 1 Kings 6:1, we have in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, the month of Ziph, which is the second month that he began to build the house of the Lord. That date is repeated in 2 Chronicles, and Jewish history and the Talmud records that the month Ziph, the second month, is when all the events of Passover have settled down and normal life begins, then you sort of count back to the beginning of your reign, and so retroactively you count your reign from the 1st of Nisan, the new year for kings. That's what we have in this account of the crucifixion of Christ. We have Jesus, just as King David, just as Solomon, being crowned on Passover after the Passover Seder. Then his reign, that is the reign of David, the reign of Solomon, the other kings, began to be counted from the 1st of Nisan, retroactively back to the 1st of the month, the 1st of Nisan. Jesus was crowned then early on the 15th of Nisan. Pilate took Jesus, chapter 19, and scourged him. The soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. This is the coronation of Christ. How do we know it's the coronation of Christ? It happened on the day of the crowning of kings. And it was witnessed by temple authority and Roman authority, both of whom agreed he's the king. And in fact, Pilate said, "Here's your king. Look, here's your king." And in fact, the Jews had tacitly acknowledged that he was king because they wanted him killed since he had declared himself the Son of God. They put that crown of thorns on his head. They put on him a purple robe. Now let's read on a little bit. Verse 17. After they took Jesus and led him away, and he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place of the skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and 2 others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the middle. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, but it was outside the wall. And it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. This title block was commonly put on every cross when an enemy of the state was crucified. The Romans chose crucifixions for non-Roman citizens, and it was specifically used to make an example of somebody on a public throughway. You had a place where a lot of people customarily passed up and down a road. You would put up a cross by the road, and you'd hang a guy there with a sign above his head naming his crime. Well, that's a fairly effective law enforcement technique. If you take one look at that and say, I don't want that to happen to me, I'm not going to do that crime. In this case, something is really, really different. Usually the titulus or title block that's put above the head of the criminal is written by a more or less third-level bureaucrat, somebody below the level of centurion. And there is a lot of historical evidence for this, which I don't have time to go into. But in this case, Pilate wrote the titulus himself in his own hand. We're going to find that out as we read on. This makes this a very unusual case. And not only did he write it, but he wrote it in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. What's the issue? What's the charge? You remember back here when he was first brought, Pilate stood on the steps of the Antonia fortress and he says, "What accusation bring against this man?" Well, he said he was king. Called himself Son of God. So the whole issue is, was this man King of the Jews? And we've seen that the question is solved. Yes, he is the King of the Jews. And both groups wanted him killed because he said he was king. He said it to the Jews by saying he was the Son of God. He said it to Pilate because he told Pilate, "I received my power from above, just as you do." And that made Pilate a believer. Pilate, I think in a very strange way, became a believer in Jesus that day. Not unto salvation. He just believed Jesus was the King of the Jews and he wanted to be rid of him. So he writes this titulus and he puts it up. This title then read many of the Jews. For the place where Jesus was crucified was near to the city. It was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Then said the chief priest of the Jews to Pilate, "Write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." I think he wrote it with his own hand. Very unusual for a procurator, someone who is about one step down from the halls of the Roman emperor, to write that titulus. Very, very unusual. Very unusual indeed. So Jesus has had 2 Jewish trials, one before Annas, one before Caiaphas. We're not going to go into detail all the things that happened to him that day. We simply don't have the time. But he was crowned king that day. On the day of the coronation of kings, his reign would be counted retroactively back to the 1st of Nisan. And he took upon himself a crown, not a royal diadem, but a crown of thorns. Which takes us back to Genesis 3:17, 18, and 19. God spoke to Adam, and he said, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." Thistles and thorns began growing instead of good crops. The ground was cursed. And I want to suggest that as Adam's sin resulted in a curse of the ground, as documented here in Genesis 3:18, Jesus removed that curse with the cleansing power of his own blood. As those Roman soldiers put that crown down over his head and his blood flowed through those thorns, he was removing not only the sin of mankind in the process of crucifixion, but removing the curse of the ground. He removed the curse from the earth. And at the very same time and in the very same way, he was proclaimed king by Jews and Gentiles. They all knew he was king, and they wanted him dead. Do you know he's king? Of course you do. Do you want him dead? No. But he had to die, and he did it in order that we might live. And that's the story of today, the resurrection of Christ. Colossians 1:20 says concerning Christ, having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself. By him, I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. In other words, the blood of Christ cleansed our sin, but it also removed the curse from the earth. And there will come a day when he comes back to set up the kingdom that thorns are going to be past tense. They're as good as past tense right now because he's removed the curse from the ground at the same time that he removed our sin and became king. So he was taken to the cross that morning. And as the cross was elevated at 9 a.m., he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." You know, that takes us all the way back to the first millennium and Adam and Eve, who sinned in the garden. They sinned a grievous sin by eating the forbidden fruit. And Jesus, looking at humanity, says what? He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It reminds us of the innocence of Adam and Eve. They didn't have a foggy clue as to what they were doing. They were led the wrong way by the serpent. The second thing that Jesus said from the cross that day was to the good thief. He said, "Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise." Takes us back to the idea of redemption that came following the flood. First came sin, then came the destructive flood, and then a new world. The third thing Jesus said on the cross, "Woman, behold thy son." Looking at John, saying in effect, John is going to take care of you. But in a larger sense, Jesus is saying to the woman, Israel, I'm going to take care of you. How am I going to take care of you? Well, I'm going to take care of you by very, very carefully selecting your style of life. I'm going to give you a way of life. I'm going to give you leaders. And I'm going to give you the ultimate leader. He's going to be called King. At 12 noon, the sun went out. And Jesus said at that moment, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Father, Father, where are you? Where have you gone? In English, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's the crux of human history. The sun went out that day. And it went out so that it could come back on again. And when it came back on again, it promised us resurrection. A little later, while the sun is still out, Jesus knew that his time on the cross was coming to an end, and he said something interesting. He said, I thirst. That was the fifth statement that he made from the cross. I thirst. Who is Jesus? He's the water of life. And Jesus is talking essentially, projecting himself into the world, and he's saying, this is the condition of the world. It's dying of thirst. But I bring the water of life. He took upon himself the sins of mankind. The sixth thing that he said, which basically is a cry of triumph, which I think he made just as the sun came back out again. The sun was out for some hours, some say 3 hours. And after he had said, I thirst, you remember they put that sponge filled with vinegar and gall up to his mouth, and that was supposed to give him some relief. Actually, that was mockery. Right after he turned away from that sponge, he said, it's finished. Tetelestai, it has been accomplished. And he bowed his head and he gave up the ghost. But just before he completely died, he uttered the last statement. Right after he said, it is finished, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he gave up the ghost. When he commended his spirit unto the Father, that was an act that has repercussions to this very day. Because what happened? He declared victory in the third heaven. He went forth, he rose, he became our high priest, daily making an approach to the Father for us in the temple of heaven. When we read in John about his resurrection, the most famous image, I think, of his resurrection is Peter and John running to the tomb. You look at John chapter 20, verse 3, Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, that would be John, they came to the sepulchre, so they ran both together. And the other disciple did outrun Peter, and came first to the sepulchre, and he, stooping down, looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet he went not in. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, went unto the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. The verb to see, used in the 8th verse, where it says, and he saw, means he studied. It's the Greek word theatros, which means to carefully look at something and analyze what you're seeing. He saw, he analyzed what he saw, and he believed. What did he believe? He believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Why did he believe it? Because he saw the linen clothes lying, and I believe they were lying as though a body was still in them. And then he saw the sudarion, a separate piece of cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, not lying with the body wrappings, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Verse 7, where it says wrapped together, that's a Greek verb that means to roll around something or to wind. And what I think he saw was a ball of cloth in the shape of a head, but there was no head inside of it. And so John looks at this and studies it. He says, there should be a body inside of those clothes, but there's not. And suddenly he believed. It all came together for him. Everything Jesus had been saying. He says, I've got to die. I've got to rise again. I won't be gone for long. I'm coming back. All these things that he started saying back in John 14. I go to prepare a place for you. You can't come where I'm going, but I'm going to fix that place, and then I'm going to come back. And all of this snapped into focus here in John 20, verse 8. Then went in also that other disciple which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw, he studied, and he believed. He believed now unalterably that Jesus had the power over death. You know, this dialogue, which we've been studying for several weeks, started back in John 14. You remember Jesus says, I'm going, and he says, you can't come with me. And remember, Thomas had said to him, Lord, how can we possibly know the way? And Jesus said, I'm the way. Jesus said, I'm the way. It's kind of fascinating when you look at Thomas here in the 20th chapter of John, verse 26. And after 8 days, again his disciples were within, Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you. And then said he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, behold my hands. Reach hither thy hand, thrust into my side. Be not faithless, but believing. And Thomas answered and said unto him, My Lord and my God. Jesus saith to him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. Now this is the same Thomas that back in John 14:5 had said, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Well, now it's 8 days later, and it all boils down to Thomas answering and saying, My Lord and my God. That's the trip we all make. We all go from doubt to the point where we just say, My Lord and my God.